going to talk today about the politics that led up to the war in Vietnam and a little bit about Vietnam, and then we'll come back to the 60s again and talk about women's rights movement, feminism, and counterculture. But today we'll talk about sort of politics in the 60s, and it really some of the main events of this era were one was the Bay of Pigs, which some of you know a little bit about. But the Bay of Pigs is a region in Havana, which is in Cuba. Until 1959, Cuba had a dictator named Batista who was backed by the Americans, and he was backed by the Americans because he was an anti-communist. It was not good to the Cuban people. In fact, he allowed organized crime to come in and run huge parts of Havana and Cuba, especially the casinos that were down there. And a lot of rich people went down to Cuba and blew a lot of money, but the life for the people in Cuba was getting worse, not better. So there was a communist revolution in Cuba led by a guy named Fidel Castro, who was very young. He led a revolution. He took the place of the dictator and made Cuba, which is just, 50-some miles off the coast of Florida, a communist country, which we didn't like. So America ended all ties with Cuba. Cuba needed help. It was a third world country, not a very wealthy country. So it no longer had the help of the United States. It went to the other superpower. It went to the Soviet Union. I don't know what the leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, is doing with his other hand here, but maybe he's tickling Fidel Castro. So the communists were successful in Cuba. America was afraid that it would lead to other revolutions throughout Central, South America, the Caribbean. That was the fear. Pardon me. So Kennedy wanted to get rid of Castro. And he began to train defectors. A lot of Cubans left during the Communist Revolution, and they were in Florida. So he began to train these ex-patriots, these Cubans, to reinvade Cuba at this place called the Bay of Pigs. When that happened, they were not supported. They did not get the support from the American government that they expected. The CIA completely and totally blundered this event. It was a disaster, pinned on the president, although mostly it was CIA's fault, and it really looked bad for the United States. And in Berlin, one of the other big events, we've talked about the Berlin airlift. It saved West Berlin. The Soviets were still looking for a way to stop people from escaping communist Germany. So Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev tried to force Kennedy to make a German division in East Germany and West Germany permanent. And the whole goal of the United States from the end of World War II till the current year, 1960, was that the German East and West should be united again. He's so angry here he took off his shoe. You can see, and he started pounding it on the podium in the United Nations. So Kennedy says, no, we'll fight for Germany if we have to. And he doubles the size of the United States Army. He doubles the budget for the Army. He begins a program preparing for nuclear war, where we begin building fallout shelters across the country in case there is a nuclear war. And the Soviets build the Berlin Wall, which we've already talked a little bit about. And that finally separates completely East and West Berlin. And there's a better picture of the wall. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis happens. And this is, to help protect the Cubans, the Soviets begin to assemble missiles that can reach the United States from Cuba. Short-range missiles. We had missiles in Turkey. We had missiles in England. We had missiles in Germany facing the Soviet Union. So we had countries that were right next to the Soviet Union holding American bombs. But by God, we were not going to allow the communists to put missiles in Cuba. So Kennedy knew he had to do something about this. And Khrushchev thought Kennedy was young and was weak and wouldn't do anything about it. Here was Kennedy's possible responses. Negotiate, invade Cuba, blockade Cuba, bomb Cuba, and in the end he decided to blockade Cuba. And this is a U.S. destroyer coming alongside a ship that was suspected of bringing parts to Cuba for that, the assembly of those bombs. The Soviets eventually backed down and recalled the ships and dismantled the bombs, and the only time once they dismantled the bombs once we agreed to take our missiles out of Turkey, which was sort of a deal we made with them. And here are the effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. From that point on until the end of the Soviet Union, there was a hotline between the White House and the Kremlin, between the two capitals, where the two offices of the president and the leader of the Soviet Party in Russia. And they signed a limited test ban treaty to limit the number of nuclear testing that could go on. All right, moving on. Lyndon Johnson becomes president after Kennedy, and he ramps up the war in Vietnam, which we'll talk about in a second, because he is determined to stop the spread of communism into South Vietnam. All right, let's talk about that. Here's how the Vietnam War started. And here you can see here's Vietnam, a very narrow and weird-looking country next to Laos and Cambodia and Thailand, which back then was Siam. We were still practicing containment, and we were still under we were still working under the whole plan that if one country fell to communism, all its neighbors would fall too. So when communism came to Vietnam, we were going to do something about it. It had been a colony of France for a long time. The French, they had a leader in Vietnam named Ho Chi Minh, who was very friendly to communism, and he fought for independence. He is the one who led pretty much the revolution in Vietnam against the French to create a free and independent Vietnam, but ended up being communist. His organization, his rebel organization, his guerrilla warriors were called the Viet Minh. In 1954, the Viet Minh beat the French. Here you can see some pictures of the fighting there. And the French were out of Vietnam. Who was going to save Vietnam? Well, America had pledged to stop communism wherever it was. The Geneva Accords had divided Vietnam in two, just like Korea, and just like Korea. And so it's got to work, right? It worked great in Korea. There was never a war in Korea. North was going to be communist. The South was going to be free. And Ho Chi Minh up in Hanoi was going to lead the North. In the South, we had a guy named Nguyen Dinh Diem, and he led the anti-communist South. Not a very good leader. The Geneva Accords that led to the creation of North and South Vietnam called for free elections to unite the country. South Vietnam refused free elections, claiming, hey, the North's not going to have free elections. Why should we have free elections? So you pretty much had a communist dictator in the North and another dictator in the South who claimed to be a Democrat or create democracy. And Truman was stuck because he had pledged, this is before Kennedy, before Eisenhower, he had pledged American help to any country threatened by communists. So we aided the French, who lost. And then we were stuck with this system where we were helping the South and the communists in China and Russia were helping the North. President Eisenhower sent money to the South. He sent military advisors to the South. And then next class we'll talk about really the war. But this is how this is the circumstances that led to the North, of course, invading the South. That's the lecture.